If you see a naked man on the ice, run.
If you ever see a naked man standing alone on the ice in the middle of Lake Superior, do not try to rescue him. On the 9th of November 1975, the crew of a small cargo ship saw exactly that, and bringing the man aboard turned into a nightmare that none of them would survive. Luther Blackburn had spent years in the Navy and had seen things during the Vietnam War that he never wanted to remember. After leaving the military, he found work as a ship medic, hoping that life aboard a cargo vessel would be quiet compared to what he had experienced during the war. In November of 1975, he joined the crew of the SS Lily Marina, a small cargo ship traveling across Lake Superior. The weather was already becoming dangerous when the ship left port. Snow covered the surrounding area, the temperature was dropping quickly, and the lake was beginning to fill with floating chunks of ice. Luther expected his biggest problems to be seasickness, minor injuries, or perhaps a badly cut hand. He certainly didn't expect to treat someone who wasn't supposed to be alive. On the morning of November 9th, the Lily Marina was moving through increasingly heavy snow when the lookout suddenly shouted that there was a man in the water. The crew rushed toward the deck, expecting to see one of their own sailors struggling in the freezing lake, but nobody was missing. Then they spotted him. A man was standing on a large piece of floating ice. He was completely naked. He wasn't waving for help, and he wasn't trying to swim toward the ship. He simply stood there, motionless, surrounded by freezing water and falling snow. The captain ordered the crew to bring him aboard, because leaving a person out there would almost certainly mean death. When they reached the man, the crew couldn't believe he was still alive. His skin was almost completely white from the cold, his fingers and toes were turning black, and he was unusually tall, standing close to 7 feet. They carried him inside and rushed him to Luther. Luther immediately began treating him for severe hypothermia. He covered him with blankets, warmed his body as carefully as possible, started an IV, and placed heat packs around areas where the major blood vessels were close to the skin. The man's body was barely responding, and Luther wasn't sure whether he would survive. Still, he knew there was one rule in emergency medicine. You don't give up on a severely hypothermic patient until they're warm and clearly beyond saving. After several hours, the man's condition seemed to stabilize. He remained unconscious, so Luther decided to leave the medical room for a few minutes to get something to eat. The ship's cook, Case, had prepared a hot meal, and after spending hours beside a freezing patient, Luther was starving. But when he returned to the medical room, the bed was empty. The stranger had disappeared. The blankets were scattered across the floor, the IV had been ripped from his arm, and there were several small drops of blood leading out of the room. Luther followed the trail through the narrow corridors of the ship until he reached the cargo hold. The door was slightly open. From inside came a strange sound. Crunch. Then another. Crunch. Luther slowly pushed the door open and saw the man crouching beside one of the cargo bags. The stranger was eating dried soybeans with his bare hands, shoving enormous handfuls into his mouth. He couldn't even chew them properly. He would swallow some, choke on others, vomit them back onto the floor, and immediately reach for more. Luther told him to stop because the cargo wasn't food for humans, but the stranger turned around and stared at him with an expression that looked almost childlike. His eyes were wide and confused, and pieces of food were falling from his mouth. Luther tried to convince him to return to the medical room. The man eventually followed him, and once they were back inside, he spoke for the first time. He said that he was hungry. That was almost all he could say. Luther asked Case to prepare something warm, and the cook brought 2 bowls of stew. The stranger grabbed one and drank it without using a spoon. He swallowed the entire bowl in seconds, then immediately took the second one and did the same thing. Luther had never seen anyone eat like that. He finally asked the stranger why he had been standing on the ice. The man answered that he had been waiting. Luther asked what he had been waiting for. The answer was simple: food. It made no sense. Why would a naked man stand alone on an ice floe in the middle of Lake Superior, waiting for food? Where had he come from? Why wasn't he wearing clothes? And how had he survived long enough to be rescued? Luther asked if the man had a name. He answered, Lauren. While Case went to get more food, Luther stayed in the medical room and watched Lauren carefully. Something about the man bothered him. He looked familiar, but Luther couldn't remember where he had seen him. Then Lauren began doing something even stranger. He started chewing on his own lips. At first, Luther thought it was some nervous habit caused by the cold, But Lauren kept biting harder. Luther suddenly realized that he wasn't simply chewing his lips. He was tearing pieces of them off with his teeth. Luther grabbed his arm and tried to stop him, but Lauren fought back violently. Case rushed into the room, and together they managed to restrain him long enough for Luther to inject a sedative into his IV. Lauren finally became unconscious. Luther stared at him in horror. His face was badly injured, yet there was something almost unnatural about the expression he wore while unconscious, as though he was smiling even though he had no reason to. That was when Luther's memory finally connected the stranger to someone he had seen before. A wanted poster. The name was Lauren Anderson. According to the poster, Lauren had been involved in theft and piracy around Lake Superior. He had a reputation for stealing anything he could get his hands on and was considered one of the most ruthless looters operating on the lake. Luther couldn't understand how the man on the wanted poster could possibly be the same person lying unconscious in front of him, but there was no time to investigate. The weather was getting worse, and the crew needed to continue their journey. That night, Luther decided to sleep in a room near the medical bay so he could hear if Lauren woke up. He barely slept. Early the next morning, someone began pounding on his door. It was Richard, the ship's first mate. He stumbled inside covered in blood. One of his arms had been badly injured, and Luther immediately used a belt as a makeshift tourniquet to slow the bleeding. Richard was terrified. He told Luther that Lauren had attacked him. But then he said something that made Luther's blood run cold. He said Lauren wasn't human. Luther tried to argue that Lauren was sick, injured, and possibly suffering from severe hypothermia or some kind of mental disorder. Richard told him that he had seen Lauren moving through the ship on all fours, tearing into people with his teeth. Luther still couldn't accept what he was hearing. Then another scream echoed through the ship. Luther left Richard behind and went looking for the source. When he reached the kitchen, he stopped dead. The room had been transformed into a scene of unimaginable violence. Blood covered the floor, pieces of the cook's clothing were scattered everywhere, and the body of Case was lying behind the counter. The man who had fed Lauren the night before was dead. Luther checked for a pulse even though he already knew there was no chance. Then another scream came from somewhere above him. There was no time to stand there. He ran toward it. As he climbed the stairs, he heard several gunshots. When he reached the upper deck, he found Captain Thurston badly wounded. He was missing part of one leg and had severe injuries to his arm and shoulder. Luther tried to help him, but the captain pushed him away. Instead, Thurston handed him a revolver. He told Luther that he had to kill Lauren. Luther asked what was happening. The captain told him that if Lauren couldn't be killed, the ship had to be sunk. Luther couldn't understand why. The captain's answer was simple. Whatever Lauren had become could not be allowed to reach land. Then the captain lost consciousness. Luther took the gun and continued onto the deck. The snow was coming down so heavily that he could barely see. Then he saw something moving through the storm. Lauren. But the man they had rescued the previous day was gone. His body had changed. He appeared even taller, with unnaturally long limbs and pale skin stretched tightly over his bones. His face was covered in blood, and his eyes looked strange beneath the falling snow. Most disturbing of all, he wasn't walking on two legs. He was running toward Luther on all fours. Luther raised the revolver and fired. The shot missed. Lauren charged across the deck with terrifying speed. Luther fired again. This time the bullet struck him in the head. But Lauren didn't fall. He didn't even slow down. The bullets weren't stopping him. Luther realized that whatever he was fighting was no longer a normal human being. Richard shouted from somewhere on the ship that he had another plan. He intended to steer the Lily Marina directly toward the rocks and destroy the ship rather than allow Lauren to escape. Luther tried to keep Lauren on the deck while Richard prepared the ship. But then Lauren suddenly changed direction. He wasn't coming for Luther anymore. He was going after Richard. Luther fired again and again, but the creature kept moving through the snow. It reached Richard before Luther could stop it. Luther managed to get to the door and shut it, but he couldn't save Richard. By then, the ship was already heading toward the rocks. Luther realized that he was probably the last living person aboard. He returned to his room and began writing down everything that had happened. He knew the ship was going to sink, and he knew there was a good chance nobody would ever read his journal. Still, he wanted someone to know. He wanted someone to understand what they had found that morning on the ice. And before the Lily Marina disappeared beneath Lake Superior, Luther left one final warning. If you ever see a naked man standing alone on the ice, don't let him aboard. Because he may not be waiting for rescue. He may be waiting for food. And if the story of the Lily Marina is true, then somewhere beneath the freezing waters of Lake Superior, something may still be waiting there.